Hi there, and welcome to this Marketing Measurement 101 course from Paramark. Over the course of the next 60 to 90 minutes, you will get a download on all the modern ways to measure the impact of your marketing investments, when to use which methodology, some high level information about how each of the methodologies work, and what you can do with them. So let's get started. If you're a marketer, you probably have seen this quote: half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The trouble is, I don't know which half. This was a famous quote attributed to John Wanamaker, who I think introduced the idea of advertising in newspapers and leaflets for a supermarket chain that he owned, and how to generate demand and foot traffic for that supermarket. So this problem of marketing measurement has existed for a long time. It's not always a bad thing. It doesn't mean you have to get to extreme precision, but it felt apt to start with this quote. Here's another quote that I personally love. Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. This is famously attributed to Albert Einstein, but I've seen versions of this on the internet attributed to many other people. And what this is really saying is being precise and intentional about what matters is the first step in getting measurement right. And we'll talk about that concept a lot today. And then finally, this one is probably my favorite. Measurement in marketing is a bit like the weather. Everyone talks about it, but few really understand it. And if you use a weather app, and if you follow weather predictions, you will know that even in this day and age, we get weather predictions off all the time. And many times marketing measurement can feel like that. So with that set up, let's dive straight in. Okay, I've spoken to thousands of marketers in my career, whether that was in-house roles and teams that I led, or in the last 3 years working on marketing measurement at Paramark, working with some of the top B2B and B2C brands. And the questions come down to the same sort of patterns. Whether you're looking at marketing in an aggregate sense, so overall, all of your marketing investments, or you're looking at a specific channel or a specific sub-strategy within a channel, the questions are often the same. What is marketing's incremental contribution? What's the return on marketing investment? Where do we invest the next marketing dollar? How do we adjust these allocations on an ongoing basis? How confident are we about hitting our goals? And how do we balance the short term and the long term? And hopefully by the end of this course, you'll be able to answer most of these questions, if not all of them. Let's start with the definition of the word attribution. And there can be different definitions, but in my opinion, there's a very clear meaning. The action of regarding something as being caused by a person or a thing. Now, what's interesting is that over the last couple of decades, this may not be the definition that ad platforms or attribution platforms even are using when they put dashboards and reports in front of you. And this will become apparent as we go through the rest of the course. I also want to introduce a fundamental concept of incrementality. And let's look at the definition of that word. So what is incremental? Incremental relates to or denotes an increase or addition, especially one of a series on a fixed scale. Sounds very mathematical and jargony, but what we're saying is if your sales are a series over time, so how many sales you get on any given day, are you able to increment or increase those sales as a result of what you're doing? Attribution, incrementality, they're related, but they're different. Now, if it were up to me, we wouldn't even need the word incremental or incrementality, and attribution is how we would define everything that we are going to discuss in the next few minutes here. But the reality is that the definition of attribution and how we use it in marketing has been, unfortunately, bastardized to some extent. And so we need a new word to understand the difference between attribution and incrementality, and we'll get into that. Now, what is incrementality? In the simplest of ways, you can think of the definition as follows. If a prospect would have bought regardless of the piece of marketing that you put in front of them, that marketing isn't incremental. Vice versa, if a prospect would have never bought from you until and unless they saw a piece of marketing, that's highly incremental. And so we're basically saying, did the presence of that marketing investment or of that marketing campaign cause the prospect to become a buyer? So think about that. There's cause and effect. That's what we really care about it in the word incrementality. And we're creating lift. We're creating incremental conversions or purchases. That's the essence of incrementality. Now, it's important to remember when you look at all of your sales or all of your conversions, there's always going to be some amount of organic demand. This is stuff that's just happening because you are in the marketplace. You have a website, or you have a physical store, or you are in the app store. There's going to be organic demand, somebody walking by your store, or somebody just searching for a specific solution on Google or in ChatGPT and your name popping up there. There's organic demand. There's word of mouth. There are your existing customers who are referring you to other customers, other prospects, or maybe just your friends and family sort of recommending a certain product. There's built up brand equity. This is an important part. There's a lot of stuff that happens over a longer period of time. And you can think of this as like, maybe I'll take two examples. There's Salesforce and there's Coca-Cola. Both of these brands have existed for a long, long time, and they have built up brand equity. So a lot of that is going to show up in your baseline sales. You don't need to see an advertisement for Salesforce to be aware of Salesforce. You don't need to see an advertisement of Coca-Cola to be aware of Coca-Cola. There's built up brand equity over a long period of time, and that will often show up in your baseline sales. The marketing that you're doing in any given time period, a day, a month, a year, a quarter, is, and the incremental impact that that marketing is going to have on your business is above and beyond that built up baseline brand equity. And so that's where the marketing and sales comes in. So if you're a long established brand, the amount of incremental impact that your in month or in quarter marketing is going to have is going to be relatively small because you have all this built up historical brand equity. So this is an important concept to count for when you're thinking about attribution and incrementality. Okay, here's another key concept that I want to introduce. And I know there's a lot of key concepts that I talk about, but I think these are all important and they'll help you connect the dots when we get to the actual methodologies. And that is, whether you look at a multi-touch attribution model, whether you look at a marketing mix model, whether you look at an incrementality test, whether you look at self-reported attribution models, these are all models and not really measurement in the traditional sense. The subject of measurement is not a physical thing, right? We're trying to represent reality in zeros and ones and in these digital ways, but there's always something that's going to be left behind, especially in the field of marketing. These perceptions, these attitudes, the impact that marketing has is not always very precisely measured. And so think about these as models of that real world, and those models are always going to be imperfect. All models are going to be wrong. Some are less wrong than the others. That doesn't mean that you don't use models to make decisions, but it's important to understand that there is no ground truth. There is no reality in these models. These are all just ways to better understand and develop intuition about when you change something, what happens to your numbers. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, let's start with touch-based, click-based attribution, maybe even view-through attribution, and broadly speaking, multi-touch attribution. Whether it's first touch, last touch, multi-touch, view-through, click-through, all of these can probably be represented in one bucket of attribution models. And it's important to understand how these models work, where the gaps are, so you can make informed decisions about when you want to rely on them and when you don't. So how do these models even work? They're quite simple, right? So usually if you're watching this course, you've seen UTM codes, click IDs. For those folks who don't know what UTMs are, go type it in ChatGPT. I think it's an Urchin Tracker. This was a company that had built this whole attribution methodology that got bought by Google. And so Google then adopted UTMs, and that's, now the history. And we've been using it for 20 years. Same 20-year-old technology being used to track attribution today. Click IDs are a little bit of a replacement of UTMs, but they're the same thing. Different, you have the Facebook Click ID, you have the Google Click ID, GCL ID, and so on and so forth. These are all things in the URL, in the parameters of the URL, to indicate that, hey, somebody clicked through from a certain link. That's the simplest way of thinking about UTMs and click IDs. You then have, client-side and server-side events. So when somebody lands on your website or your mobile app or, any other sort of surface that you control, you can fire off events, right? So you can say that, hey, somebody came to our website and took some action, right? Add to cart or filled out a lead form or what have you. You can fire that on the website and send that back to the ad platform. So you can send that back to Google or to Meta or to LinkedIn or what have you. Or you can fire it on the server side and send that on the back end to each of those ad platforms. We'll look at this in a little bit more detail. And then you have some software that is tracking all of these different things, right? The UTMs, the click IDs, the client-side events or the server-side events, and trying to tie all of this to a unique ID, a unique individual, a unique identity, and saying that all of these different touch points combine together, and then there's business logic that apportions credit, that this click gets this much credit, this event gets this much credit, and so on and so forth. And these are basically all your ad platforms or your marketing channels, even your emails or SMS if there are events that you can instrument and all of that. So what does that look like? It's kind of represented in this slide here. You have an ad impression, the user interacts with that ad, maybe clicks through, goes to the website. The website then feeds back into the ad platform, either from the client side or from the server side. So that's why you see the two different arrows. And that's the fundamental simplified way of looking at multi-touch attribution or touch-based attribution. Now, a couple of things to call out here. In the case of the signal going from your website to the ad platform, you're using, you might have heard pixels, right? Let's implement the Meta pixel or the LinkedIn pixel. These are just tags. These are just, JavaScript code on your website that communicates to Meta, LinkedIn, TikTok, that, hey, this user came to our website and took an action that we think is valuable. Now, there's lots of issues there. There's, if you don't accept cookies, and you might remember that from your marketing practice, the website may not be able to send that signal back to the ad platform. Or, there are ad blockers that might prevent the JavaScript from even firing. There's all types of issues. There might be GDPR issues, CCPA issues. These are privacy protocols that have been implemented by different geographies. And generally, things are getting more and more privacy-centric over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. Apple famously has even started stripping out UTM codes in certain instances if you're using Apple Mail or iMessages or so on and so forth. So generally, the client-side stuff is very suspect in terms of being able to successfully feed signals back into the ad platform. Now, the server side, much better. The server side, and you'll see this term, CAPI, Conversion API. Again, if you don't know what that is, I would recommend you go ChatGPT or Claude or go Google Conversion API and learn about sort of how those systems work. But this is your server communicating directly to the ad platform. So this is wherever your website is hosted, right? So if it's proprietary, you have your own sort of SaaS website, or if you're on Shopify has CAPI connections into all the ad platforms and so on and so forth. And what that's doing is saying, hey, this particular user with this particular IP address, maybe even this email, this phone number, if you've collected all that first-party data, is somebody we like. We want you, the ad network, to send us more people like this. And so your CAPI integrations are critical. And if you've not invested in CAPI, you have a huge issue. Okay. So now you looked at all of the different ways in which we collect data. And then, there's all of this infrastructure to feed that data back into the ad platforms so that ad platforms can, do more on your behalf, find more people, and, put your brand in front of them. Okay, great. Now, that was all of the data. Now, how does the actual sort of MTA models work, right? So there's many publicly available software solutions, both for B2B and for B2C. If you're in the Shopify ecosystem, you must have heard of many, many MTA solutions. Same thing for B2B SaaS companies. And generally what ends up happening is once you look at all this data, some of it gets captured in these models and some of it just doesn't. And some of it is incomplete. So I'll give you some examples. All right. If you're a brand that's doing billboards, right? So it's represented through what's out of home, OOH here. There's no digital touch. There's no digital capture. There's no click-through, view-through, none of that. So that doesn't get captured into your MTA models at all. If you do things like podcast advertising, again, somebody listens to your ad and maybe goes direct into your website and converts. You'll just see that as direct, right? Things like Google and email, a little bit easier to capture, right? So if somebody's searching for a non-branded term or a branded term or clicking through from an email, it's easy to capture the UTM code and that will show up pretty well. But things like Meta and YouTube are kind of somewhere in between, right? They're partially captured. This happens all the time. You see an ad on Meta or on LinkedIn. You don't immediately click through and, buy something or convert. You're really there for entertainment or solving your boredom. But you might remember that 3 days later, you open up your laptop and then you click through from, a direct sort of search on Google. And again, some people might click through directly from Meta, some people might not. And so that's the incompleteness of an MTA model. And, you talk to any of the MTA experts and they'll explain the same thing to you, that there are levels of completeness, there's levels of sophistication of what's possible to be captured and what's not. And you need to be aware of this if and when you are using multi-touch attribution models. If you're just doing first touch, last touch, that obviously has its own issues. Obviously, anything last touch. And generally, I say this, all multi-touch attribution models are going to bias towards bottom of the funnel, direct response type of activity and ignore anything that might be a little bit more awareness, reach focused or mid-funnel or top of funnel focused. And that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's a little bit of, information on multi-touch attribution. We talked about first touch, last touch. There are some companies will let you do, more sophisticated types of multi-touch attribution models, U-shape and W-shape and time decay and Markov chain. And all that is saying is that, hey, how do we distribute the weight between all the different digital touch points that we have captured? And so, maybe we want to give more weight to the first touch point and the last touch point, but not all the middle touch points. They get, lesser weight. And you can think about that as a U-shape and so on and so forth. There's plenty of stuff to just Google or chat, GPT about each of these if you want to get smart. But the questions that you have to ask yourself, put yourself in the consumer's shoe and really think about it from your own personal experience. If you click a link on Google or on LinkedIn or any other surface, is that link click what caused you to convert? Is there a cause and effect relationship between that link click and that eventual conversion? Sometimes yes, but not always. It's possible that something else led you to first search for and then click that link. This happens to me all the time in my personal life. I find a bunch of new products on Instagram. I'm in the market right now for some clothes, and Instagram somehow has figured that out and gives me lots of great recommendations and ads on new shirts and new jackets and what have you. And many times I will go to the brand direct on my laptop a couple of days later to do more in-depth research. I add them to my Pinterest board. Yep, I've become a Pinterest user. And then, maybe I will buy directly from that brand or maybe sometimes even Amazon because I'm a Prime user. So is it possible that something else led me to first search for and click on something in Amazon? Hell yes. And then there's another question of, would you have converted anyway, even if you did not click on that link? This is, a great example of this is branded search. Many times when you go and search for a brand on Google, the first link that you see is a sponsored branded search ad, and then the organic search result is way lower. And if I did not have that branded search link, I would still scroll down and click on that organic link. And so sometimes you have, a false positive relationship between a branded search ad and the eventual conversion. So these are all examples of questions that I would ask yourself to really understand, are these multi-touch attribution models or first touch, last touch attribution models, do they really represent cause and effect? And what you will come to realize over time as you sort of dig into this is that these digital touch points are not useless. They're helpful. They help you understand sort of the buyer journey to some extent, the digital part of the buyer journey, but they're a narrow view of the world, especially if you're a high growth, larger growth brand. And you're scaling, you're growing, you're spending millions of dollars across multiple different channels and relying on just digital tracking or behavioral analytics, which is probably a better way to call multi-touch attribution, you're going to have a very narrow view and you're never going to be able to have the right measurement framework to test out channels like, paid social and paid video and CTV and podcasts and direct mail and all of this other stuff that's required as you scale beyond a small brand. Here's a great example from more than a decade ago. And actually, I think I used to work at eBay's subsidiary company, PayPal, when this first got published. So back in 2011, I think, eBay partnered with some Berkeley professors to launch this test where they actually turned off all branded SEM for a period of time, both on Google and on Microsoft's ad network. And they looked at what happened. And what they saw was when they turned these branded SEM ads off, nothing really changed. All the clicks and traffic that is getting attributed to Google and to Microsoft paid ads started getting attributed to organic. And that was it. And so that was a huge first time. Maybe it wasn't the first time, but it got a lot of attention. And yet you see many, many brands continue to invest in branded SEM without ever actually testing it for themselves. Now, I'm not saying that there is no place for branded SEM, but if you haven't run a test that is of this nature, either nationally or in specific geographies, then you might be wasting a certain amount of money, and that money might be better allocated in other categories, non-branded search, YouTube, Meta, pick your favorite ad platform. Okay, another thing that's really interesting is even the behemoths of advertising, right? So Google, Meta, LinkedIn, they've all launched this feature called Conversion Lift. And you don't have to have any fancy software or data scientists. These are tools that are self-serve, that are available to you. And all of these folks, right? Google is the one that promoted UTMs and click IDs and all that fun stuff. They recognize the limits of those attribution models. And to solve for that, they have launched Conversion Lift. And I would encourage you to go look at these videos. Just type Conversion Lift into YouTube. You'll see Google's tutorials, Meta's tutorials, LinkedIn's tutorials about how they work. And they help you run true tests on those platforms to understand the incrementality of Google ads or Meta ads or LinkedIn ads. And we'll cover some of that in a subsequent section as well. Okay, so that was multi-touch attribution. Hopefully it gives you a good sense of what it is, how it works, and what have you. What's gotten very popular in the last few years is this idea of self-reported attribution. I like to use Heidi How. How did you hear about us? I don't know if everyone uses that shortened moniker, Heidi How. I kind of like the sound of it. And so we'll talk about that. What does that mean? That means that you put a form on your surface. Now, this could be, during a mobile sign up. It could be during a post-purchase flow on an e-commerce website. It could be during the lead form submission for a SaaS tool. It can be placed in any, part of your buyer journey as long as you're doing it, intelligently. And you ask a very simple question. How did you hear about us? Now, this is arguably very simple. It's very easy. It's very clear what you're doing. And it takes away some of that subjectivity, right? That can be apparent in your multi-touch attribution models because you're not placing any weight. You're getting direct input and feedback from your audience. And so surely that's better than a subjective weighting based on what an analyst thinks, where the credit should go. And if implemented well, this is extremely helpful. And, even at Paramark, we're a small company. We don't have millions of dollars in budget. I can imagine, using the principle here for better understanding how people hear about us, right? When somebody books a demo, I ask them like, hey, how did you hear about us? Like, tell us about sort of what's going on in your world that, motivated you to reach out, and what research are you doing, and so on and so forth. The problem is if you use it incorrectly. So survey design and survey research methodology is a science, and it's based on statistics. It's based on math. And if you don't understand those fundamental principles, it's very easy to go wrong. So I'll give you an example. If you don't randomize the order of the radio buttons here in this example, or if you start saying things like Instagram ads versus Instagram organic, that's a little bit suspect, because your audience may not know the difference between an ad versus an organic post. They just remember Instagram. And then you have other issues, right? A TikTok short, an Instagram reel, a YouTube short, they start to blend together because they're all very similar formats. And so when you ask your audience, hey, where did you hear about us? It's very possible that they misremember where they actually heard about you. It's like, even me, after, the same example, maybe I did a bunch of research on Instagram and then directly on the website. And maybe I talked to a friend. I remember asking somebody on WhatsApp, hey, what shirt brands are you into? So it's very hard to isolate one specific thing that I might remember in terms of how I heard about a specific brand. And then you see many brands have like a laundry list of options, like 10 options, 15 options. And again, that's a no-no. On the other hand, if you put in just an empty box and try to do it behind the scenes, so you're not biasing the customer by presenting them discrete options, that has other challenges. Sometimes people will just say, Google, internet, research, family, friends. And is that really helpful in, helping you make decisions? So something that I recommend is, if you are going to do this, and it's not a bad idea to do it, but go into it with realistic expectations. And if you are going to put some options, introduce some options that you don't advertise on. So if you've never done TV, put TV there. If you've never done Meta, put Meta there. And I wouldn't use Meta, I would say Facebook. And what you will notice is, even though you don't advertise on Facebook or on TV, it's possible that some of your audience just picks that option because of human behavior. We're just lazy. We're just picking an option and just moving on because we really don't want to fill out a survey. We're just here to get the product that we want and be on our merry way. That'll help you understand the noise in your data set before you go and make huge decisions about where your audience is finding you. So, questions to ask yourself: do you really remember when you saw a piece of marketing? This is my own personal example. I live in the Bay Area in San Francisco. I see ads for Salesforce on LinkedIn and email on the highway. It displayed all over the internet, events. And it's impossible for me to tell you where I first heard about Salesforce. That's a silly question to even ask. Now, if you're just getting started and this is your first time doing any type of advertising and it's isolated to like one or two channels, it might work. So try it for yourself. Be aware of the pitfalls. And, I talked about how research methodologies are a whole science, and you shouldn't take them just for granted because somebody says, hey, you can put this survey on your website and get good results. So here's an example. This was an online survey. I think it was a paid survey that was done by Pew Research. I think it's a think tank on a whole bunch of social research and studies. And they did this just to demonstrate this fact of how, online surveys can be quite problematic. They ran this survey where they asked people, hey, are you qualified to be a nuclear submarine operator? Guess what? 12% of people said yes. The real answer is probably closer to 0%, right? Statistically speaking, maybe a 0.000000001%. But that's the inherent nature of survey methodologies, that if you don't construct them right, or if you don't have a controlling variable, they can mislead you to believe that, hey, 12% of the US population is qualified to run a nuclear submarine. That's obviously not the case. Now, I'm not saying that all your Heidi-How data or self-reported attribution data is garbage. That is not at all what I'm saying. Again, just understand the pitfalls of these types of methodologies. The next one that we're going to talk about is marketing mix modeling, MMM. This methodology has actually existed for a long time. It was invented, I believe, in the 60s and the 70s by these advertisers and large brands and these academic institutions who were doing all this advertising on TV, on the radio, on newspapers and coupons and all these different things. They didn't have Google and Meta. They didn't have any digital tracking, and they still needed to figure out, hey, should I invest more money or not in, this media channel or that other media channel, this newspaper or that other newspaper? And so it's been around for a while. It used to be done by hand in spreadsheets. Then, you had sort of physical spreadsheets and by hand, and then, digital spreadsheets on a computer. And then you had more statistical software come up, and it's gotten easier and easier and better and better. And I think it's reached a point where now it's making a massive comeback because of how it works. We'll talk about exactly that. Okay. Before we can talk about MMM, it's important to understand this concept of correlation. Marketing mix models are a correlational methodology. They depend on identifying correlations between different parts of your marketing mix and your business outcomes. So what is a correlation? And I have this very simple chart. Let's actually start with the chart or the version on the extreme right here that shows a scatter plot of two axes. We can say maybe the x-axis represents the spend on any given day on a given channel, and y represents the contribution of sales or maybe just like total sales on that day. Forget about the, which channel it came from. So what that scatter plot is telling you in that particular example on the one on the extreme right is that no matter where your spend is, whether it's high or low, right? So whether it's sort of on the left side towards the zero on the x-axis, or if it's going to the right side on the higher end of the x-axis, the sales are randomly distributed. And so there is no pattern. There is no correlation. On the other hand, you see a couple of charts on the left, and what you're seeing here is like, there's a positive correlation. As your spend goes towards the higher end of the x-axis, you also see sales, if that's what's represented with the y-axis, go up and to the right. Very positive correlation. As you increase spend on your marketing investments, your sales go up and to the right. That's a great outcome. That's what a correlation is. A negative correlation was the exact opposite, where we're saying as spend goes up, your sales actually come down. That doesn't actually really happen in the marketing world, but that's just to show you what the concept of a correlation is. You're trying to understand the relationship between two different metrics. So I said a little bit earlier that marketing mix modeling is a correlational methodology, and I'll explain how it works. Now, let's say you work on an e-commerce brand and you're selling t-shirts. So what MMM does is it looks at your last 2 years, 3 years, 4 years of sales history. So how many t-shirts are you selling on January 1st, on January 2nd, on January 3rd, and so on and so forth. That's what the sales line represents, right? There's some natural sort of movement in that line. It's not always the same number of t-shirts every given day. And then we look at all the different marketing channels, paid, owned, earned. This might include TV and Google, Meta and TikTok, influencers, your emails, your SMS, what have you. And we look at impressions or proxy of impressions in each of those channels. And so what we're saying is, hey, find the relationship between the investments that you're making in any given channel and that t-shirt sales number. So what does the model actually do? What the model actually does is says, hey, it seems like over the last 2 years, every time you increase your TV spend, your sales seem to go up. When you pull back on TV spend, your sales seem to go down. And we're finding a very strong correlation between those two trend lines. On the other hand, we're not seeing a correlation with Google. We're saying, regardless of whether you increase or decrease the spend on Google, your sales don't seem to interact with that channel much. And so this is a hypothetical example that shows that TV has very high correlation, Google not so much, Meta and TikTok have weaker than TV correlation, but stronger than Google correlation. Now, that's the essence of what a marketing mix model is. No UTM codes, no click IDs. We're not trying to track the digital part of the buyer journey. We're looking at aggregate time series analysis of when you make changes to your marketing mix, what impact does that have on sales? Now, the data science and the machine learning behind this is quite nuanced and sophisticated. So this is a very generalized explanation. If you are curious, I would highly recommend you go into ChatGPT or Claude and ask it the questions that you want to ask it to get a deeper understanding. Now, there are a few concepts that we're going to cover in the next few slides. Now, why is this called marketing mix modeling and not media mix modeling? Some people call it media mix modeling. If we just look at media, right? So we're talking about paid media, owned media, earned media, then yeah, this would be a media mix model. What makes a media mix model and a marketing mix model different are non-media variables. So let's talk about this. Maybe there is inventory implications for this t-shirt business, right? So they're just running out of inventory. So it doesn't matter how much you invest in marketing, there's nothing to buy. So you have inventory issues. So you may want to represent inventory as a variable in your MMM. Or maybe you do a lot of promotions and discounts and sales on your website. And that is a factor that affects your sales volume differently from your media investments. So that's another variable or factor to consider in your MMM. Maybe you have retail partners, or maybe you have not just your direct-to-consumer website, but you also sell on Amazon. And so you start to develop a much bigger picture of all of your sales channels and your marketing channels and your non-media variables. And that's the distinction between a media mix model and a marketing mix model. You know, it depends on how sophisticated you are as a business, how much data do you have about non-media channels, if it makes sense to kind of go down that path. Okay, now, as I mentioned, this methodology has existed for a long time, but what's happened in the last few years is even the likes of Google and Meta and many other sort of companies have created open source AI or ML powered platforms to help you do marketing mix modeling. Robin is Meta's open source model. Meridian or Lightweight MMM are Google's open source models. And, you know, if these large ad platforms are also moving in this direction, then you can be pretty confident that these are going to become more and more mainstream. And that's what I expect in the next 5 to 10 years is if you are a medium or large size brand, you are going to be running these marketing mix models on a weekly or monthly basis. Okay. And you're not going to be alone, right? So whether it's large CPG companies, marketplace companies, SaaS companies, almost all of the leaders in these categories are using these machine learning based MMMs to make sense of what's working and what's not working. These are all sort of publicly available articles. I would encourage you to go Google them, read about how these teams are doing it. And when I use the word AI on the previous slide, that is not the same as LLMs. We're not talking about large language models and ChatGPT. We're talking about statistical models. And there's a huge difference between the two. We're not trying to make predictions about the next word or the next sentence. We're trying to make predictions about trend lines using regression and machine learning. Okay. So as you go on this journey of building a marketing mix model, the first and the most important thing is what is the target metric that you are going to be optimizing towards. The most important thing to get right for a marketing mix model is probably the target metric that you are optimizing towards. And here are some interesting sort of considerations that you should be thinking about if you are working on an MMM project. Number one, it should be a metric that's directly influenced by marketing activities. Number two, it should follow the marketing activity as soon as possible. Number three, it should be how you measure marketing's impact on the business. So getting all three of these right might be challenging because we all know in most businesses, your CFO or your CEO are going to say revenue. That's what matters. Marketing drives revenue all the way down to, money in the bank. The reality is there's many things that might happen in between your marketing spend and something eventually converting to revenue. And so for businesses that have a fast cycle, so if you're buying, widgets online and it's a $5 purchase, it's very possible that your marketing impacts revenue very directly. If you have a longer consideration cycle, think about buying a car, buying a home, or even buying a $10,000, consumer product, or you're buying B2B SaaS, which is hundreds of thousands of dollars. Those consideration cycles are longer, and you might need to pick a leading indicator that is, in fact, a leading indicator of future revenue. So be very careful in terms of what metric you pick. Maybe you can build models to multiple different metrics, but that's an important consideration. So an example here, if you were thinking about a mobile app, a fintech app, a good number would be number of users who installed your app. A bad metric might be number of transactions made by the user 180 days after their fintech account is funded. There's so many things that might have happened between your marketing happening and those 180 days that you might pick up false correlations or false signals. Now, in some cases, it might be useful and valuable to do a predicted metric like an LTV or a forecasted LTV, right? So if you predict or forecast an LTV on day one of a particular mobile app or a SaaS subscription or even a new e-commerce customer, and you want to see marketing's impact on that predicted LTV, you can. Predicted metrics can sometimes be noisier because you're layering on one prediction on top of another prediction. You're trying to predict the impact of marketing on a metric that is also a predicted metric. So there's some nuances there, and be careful and have a deep conversation with your analytics and data science team about that. I'm going to give you some examples of some mistakes that we see. So here's a realistic chart of a target metric. You see this blue line that's representing that target metric. And when you do a whole bunch of analysis, you're like, oh, the spend started in July of 2020. That's the red line. But the blue line, the target metric, was basically empty all the way till January of 2022. What went wrong? And so really pay attention to the completeness of your data and also the accuracy of your data. So you'll see another huge spike in, I think it's something like March or April of 2023. And when we talked to this team who was building this MMM, they realized that that spike is not an actual spike in their target metric. It's not a good thing. It was actually a bad thing. There was a whole bunch of low quality conversions that are in that data. And so you want to clean up these types of issues. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck with garbage in, garbage out. You're going to be training the model with false data, fraudulent data, incomplete data, and that's absolutely going to lead you down the wrong path. So we talked about how marketing mix modeling is helping you find the correlations between each of those channels and your sales metrics, right? And we used the example of a t-shirt business, an online t-shirt business. Now, there's this concept of Adstock. It's just fancy jargon for maybe my data science friends are going to scream at me and tell me it's not fancy. It has a meaning. It has a meaning, but what it means is it's the lag effect of your marketing investments. So what is this chart showing? It's showing an x-axis where you have time units. So this could be days, it could be weeks, it could be months. And then you have the y-axis, which is showing, on a scale of 0 to 1, the percentage of effect. So what this is saying is that for any given channel, and here you can see channel 0, if whatever the impact that it's having on your business is at the maximum on day 0, then it's possible that that effect sort of continues on for a long period of time, even beyond that immediate day. So what is it saying in practical terms? I see an ad on YouTube for that t-shirt business on a Monday, and some people are going to convert by, out of all the people who are cohorted and who saw the ad on Monday, some people are going to convert on Monday itself. Some people might convert on Tuesday. Some people might convert on Wednesday or Thursday or Friday or so on and so forth. And so this curve, this decaying curve, represents that lag effect of all of the investments that you made on Monday and how they continue over time. So every cohort of investment on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday will have this corresponding Adstock, corresponding lag effect. And the model is simulating that effect without you having to specify it. So that's Adstock. That's an important consideration. This helps you understand not just what happened on the day off, but also helps you understand the longer term effect of any given marketing investment or channel. There's another concept called saturation effect. So we all know this as marketers that, if you invest $100 in 2022 in a given channel and you get some return, and if you invest the same $100 in 2023, the return might be a little bit lower. And in 2024, it might be even lower. In 2025, it might be even lower for the same $100. So what we're saying here is that the return is not always linear. If it was that, life would be amazing. But there's always a saturation effect in any given channel. And so the model also attempts to simulate what that saturation effect is. And you'll notice that at certain parts of this curve, it looks like it's going up and to the right. And at certain other parts of the curve, it starts to look a lot more flatter. Now, what is the shape of this curve? It's going to be different for different channels. It's going to be different at different points of time in history. And it's also dependent on what you're putting in to that particular channel. So it's possible to break out of plateaus and what have you. But both of these concepts, the Adstock, the lag effect, and saturation effects together help the model better understand the true impact of your marketing investments on your t-shirt sales. Okay, so with those concepts out of the way, the next thing to talk about is what does the actual data look like that you feed into an MMM, right? So before you can run this model, and typically you do this, you'll have a data science team or you'll work with an external vendor who will run these for you. But they need clean data, right? We talked about the data. So you want a day-by-day summary of whatever target metric or conversion metric that you are optimizing. And then you need all of your channels, whether you do them at an aggregate level or you break this channel up into sub-channels. You need impressions or some proxy of impressions, and you need costs. And if you have, earned or owned channels where there is no cost, you just have impressions. And that's the data set that you need to compile for at least a year or two, ideally much more than that if you have all that historical data. And that's what will be fed into the marketing mix model. Now, you probably don't want to have something as, high level and aggregate as Meta. You want to break that down into Facebook and Instagram, or Facebook, Instagram, and Meta Audience Network. Or maybe within Facebook, you have 5 different strategies. You have some, awareness-focused campaigns. You have some, offers and promos. Maybe you have whitelisting with influencers, what have you. And so you want to break down each of these columns here to represent the actual media buying strategy or the media strategy within that particular channel. And again, you will notice there are no UTM codes, click IDs. It does make the data engineering teams and the marketing analytics team's job far easier and simpler. All right, now this is where we are going to get a little bit nerdy. We talked about the methodology at a high level. We understand sort of the shape of the data that needs to be fed into the models. But what is the model actually doing? How does it actually work? What is the machine learning doing? And you can think of it in this way. You'll see this formula in the middle of the screen, right? It says the KPI, which is your target metric, is equal to intercept plus trend plus seasonality plus extra features plus media channels. This is a highly simplified view. And what this is saying is that you're trying to solve this math formula where you've got your target metric on the left-hand side, and then you've got all of these different variables on the right-hand side. And you're simulating all these different variables and how they combine together that form the target metric over 2 years, right? That's why you need 2 years of data. And so the different weightings of these variables or these input metrics will together explain the target metric or not. And that's what the model is doing. And, we talked about Adstock or the lag effect. We talk about the saturation effect. All of those are also represented in this formula. And the model explores many different possible solutions, so it needs a little bit of time to run, and then it picks one that's best. Now, what is best? What best means is that whatever it's predicting is the closest to the actual. So you've got the actual, right? You've got the actual t-shirt sales over the last 2 years. And then you've got all of these different input variables. So how you combine those input variables to predict the t-shirt sales, and whichever prediction is the closest to the actuals, that's your best answer. Now, it's also possible that you have many different possible answers, and one might be slightly better than the other, and so on and so forth. And so it does give you a probabilistic answer. It's not just going to tell you that, hey, the contribution from Meta is 10% and the contribution from Google is 5%, but it'll actually give you, hey, the contribution from Meta is anywhere between 7 to 12%, with the median value being close to 10%. And so probabilities are involved, and it's not just a deterministic answer like a multi-touch attribution model. Okay, so again, you can spend some time in ChatGPT and Claude to get an even deeper understanding of how these models work, but hopefully this was a good introduction. Now, what do you get as a result from these models? What you get back, the first output, is this very simple, t-shirt sales broken out by incremental versus baseline. So think of this as, in the very beginning, I showed you this pyramid where you had baseline, which is built up of organic, word of mouth, referrals, built up brand equity over a period of time. And then everything that's above in that light purple is incremental as a result of your paid, owned, and earned media. And sometimes if you have sort of non-media variables, that can be broken out in these outputs as well. In simple terms, if you were to turn all your media down to zero, what would you lose? That's an estimate of incrementality. And then you also get a breakdown of all of the investments every month by channel, the contribution to your business outcomes, and your cost per acquisition for those channels, right? So this is a standard output from a marketing mix model. You also get a recommendation of how best to allocate your spend across different channels to maximize your t-shirt sales. And these are, just scenario plans or predictions, and we don't recommend, or you shouldn't really take these just at face value. We'll talk about another methodology on how do you evaluate and validate these outputs from your MMM. Okay, so that's the methodology. There's a ton more output that MMMs generate. You can read all about them through some online research. But the big thing is that these are all correlational models. And correlation is not causation. We've heard that term all the time. So, well, if you want to get to causation, because remember, the definition of attribution was cause and effect, the concept of incrementality is, hey, what would you lose if you were to stop doing marketing? So the only way to get to that is incrementality testing. Think of this as applying the scientific method of experimentation to your media mix. So we'll talk about incrementality testing next. An MMM might tell you something like Facebook appears to account for between 2 to 5% of signups in 2022. That's helpful, and it gives you this range. It gives you an understanding of contribution over time, but it is not entirely causal. It is a correlational methodology. So if you want to go from correlation to causation, you would want to say something like, hey, we observed an X% uptick in signups in these test markets, and we are, 90% sure that this wasn't caused by random chance. That is an experimental outcome. That's a causal outcome when you have a test and control. And this is also a point in time answer. So we ran this experiment for X number of days or weeks or months, as opposed to an answer from a marketing mix model, which is built over a longer period of correlational data. Now, how does incrementality testing work? You remember conversion lift? I talked about that in the multi-touch attribution section. It wasn't really the right place to talk about it, but I was giving you this example that there are incrementality test options, even from the Googles and the Metas and TikToks and what have you. But a more generalized way of doing incrementality testing is this concept of geo-testing or match market testing. These are different flavors of how you can construct an incrementality test without having to rely on the platform if that's an option that you don't have. In the field of geo-testing, what we do is we identify the right test and control markets based on your data. So you'll look at all of your, let's take the same example, t-shirt sales. And these t-shirt sales are happening all around the US. And we look at the sales by region over a period of time to identify which geographies, states or DMAs or cities might be a good test environment. And how do you determine that? There's a whole bunch of data science and machine learning involved there, where you have a good enough set of control or similar geographies where you do not expose them to a particular hypothesis. So we identify these test and control geographies, and then we test a specific hypothesis in those test geographies. This might be increasing spend in an existing channel, but just in those test geographies, or testing a new channel altogether, or testing a new creative, new targeting, whatever that might be. But the idea is you're isolating that test hypothesis in those test geographies and not making that change in the control geographies. And then when you do this over a period of time, you can see whether there was incremental lift or no lift, and that is your outcome or result, right? That's what you share back with the rest of your marketing team. So this is very similar to how you do A/B testing on your website, but also quite different because you can't randomly split the US population the same way you can randomly split the traffic on a website. But you can get pretty close to randomization through this test and control geography setup. So what does the process look like? You identify a bunch of hypotheses. This can come from, whatever model that you're using, whether it's a multi-touch attribution model or whether that's a marketing mix model, whether that's your Heidi How. Step 2 is you do the experiment design. So you do have to be working with a data science team or an external vendor to identify the right geographies, the right time frame, the right budget to be able to detect an effect. And the general principle here is if you aim for a 1% lift, 2% lift, if it's too small, it may not actually be visible in your data set. And so you do have to have a minimum effect that you are targeting that is significant enough where you can see very clearly in the data that there was lift, or you can say conclusively that there was no lift. So that's the experiment design. You do this before you launch the experiment, not after. Step 3 is when you now configure the ad platform, whether that's any digital platform, offline, what have you, and you let it go live. You hit publish. When the test is complete, so if it was a 4-week test, at the end of those 4 weeks, you give it an extra 1 or 2 weeks for a cool-off period, which means the last day of the spend happening in those test regions has not fully matured. We talked about that lag effect, the Adstock. So there's still a cool-off period that you want to include when you're doing the analysis. And then you analyze the results. You see if there was actually lift in those test regions compared to the control regions. And now you have a conclusive answer on what was the lift caused by this particular hypothesis. What does it look like? You can, imagine your data science team or whoever your vendor is helping you understand these geographies and the budgets, the timeframes, all that stuff. And then at the end of the day, you're looking at your actual, results, your t-shirt sales over time in those test regions and comparing them against the control regions. So what are some of the prerequisites that you need for this type of testing to work? So number 1, you need your target metrics, so in this case, t-shirt sales, broken out by the state or the DMA or the city DMA. Essentially, it's the metro area or how sort of older school media buys were done at a DMA level. And so you want these 2 columns, and you'll notice here we've looked at just state. So you've got California, but you can imagine a row for each date, for each state, and whichever metric that you are testing against. That's the data set that is required before you can even do an experiment design. Now, it's also possible to take experiment results and put them back into a marketing mix model. So you can calibrate an MMM with experiment results. And the way that this works is when you think about them working together, you start with a marketing mix model and a whole bunch of analysis and hypotheses that you generate from the mix model. You then design an experiment, you get the experiment results, you feed those results back into the MMM, and now you have a calibrated MMM. So why is this needed? It's needed because, again, back to the point that correlation is not causation, it's possible that your marketing mix model has an output or an understanding of a specific channel that's quite different from experiment results. And you can take those experiment results and feed them back into the model as a prior, which helps you sort of give direction to the model and say, hey, even though you're not picking this up through the correlational analysis, we've done an actual experiment and the real answer is closer to this particular number. And the model then sort of, learns from that prior and gets a better, more calibrated answer going forward. So testing is obviously great, but here's the hard truth. 7 to 8 out of 10 tests will result in no lift. Let that sink in, right? This is not just me telling you. There is tons of meta-analysis on this from the biggest sort of tech companies, the biggest media spenders out there, that it's very often possible for you to not find lift in many of these types of tests. And, this is true for media tests. This is true for conversion rate optimization tests. These are true for, A/B tests in your product. That's just the reality of experimentation. So you have to do a lot of expectation setting with your leadership, with your CMO, to expect that a lot of your tests are not going to show lift. That doesn't mean that it was a failure. It just means that you learned something, and you can take that lesson and inform the next test and your roadmap of tests. That's extremely important. All right, there's also a bunch of pitfalls in experimentation. So, sometimes you will hear people say, hey, we see lift, but it's not statistically significant. What does that mean? That just means you're looking at subsection of the data or a smaller time frame within that overall test period. Maybe you see a couple of spikes where it looks like lift, but there are a couple of troughs where there is no lift. And you just say like, hey, we see some lift, but it's not statistically significant. That just means there's no lift. So be very clear about the language that you use. There's either lift or no lift. And if it's inconclusive, that means that there are multiple ways to run these models, and some indicate that there is lift and some indicate there is no lift. And that just means the test may not have been well powered, which means you either didn't run it for a long enough time, or you didn't spend enough, or the test design or the geographies were not sufficient for you to get a conclusive answer. Not spending enough time preparing the test. There's always a rush in marketing to get the test out and just launch it. And if you don't do the upfront work to really design the test and make sure that you've deployed the test that you can actually spend based on the test design, you might also just end up having a ton of opportunity cost and wasted dollars. We don't want that. Different methods of analyses resulting in different results. Okay, that's a weird statement, but what we're saying here is there's different methodologies even within incrementality testing. You can do a synthetic control analysis. You can do a difference and difference analysis. And depending on the methodology, you might get some different answers. But if all of those answers are all over the place, one says there was 50% lift and the other says there was 2% lift, that's not really trustworthy. So something's going wrong there. So really understanding the methodology and understanding why one methodology might give a different result from the other becomes really important. And the last one, management souring from the fact that the first experiment did not have a positive result, didn't have any lift. This is a culture gap. And it happens in many companies where, you launch your first incrementality test and you don't see a positive result, and you feel, oh my God, we just wasted $50,000 on this test and it doesn't work. Experimentation doesn't work for us. That's not it. You are always going to have tests that don't work out. And that's part of the experimentation culture. And you want to set that up front. Now, what you do want to avoid is inconclusive answers. Those are bad. You want to avoid those, but you want to have conclusive answers on whether there was lift or no lift. Another thing that we talk about a lot is, and I get it, right? There's a lot of people in the marketing world who will say that, hey, efficiency has killed marketing and the creativity, right? The over reliance or dependence or focus on ROI is not good for us. And I generally agree, but there's always some nuance, right? So you want to aim for effectiveness before you aim for efficiency. What this means is you want to increase the incremental contribution from a given channel before you start to optimize it to reduce the cost of that channel. If you only aim for efficiency from the very beginning, if you only aim for ROI from the very beginning, you're never really going to take big risks and big swings. And that defeats the whole purpose of experimentation. So yes, at the end of the day, you want to get efficient growth, but if you don't, I don't know if weightlifting is a good analogy or not, but you got to bulk up before you cut, and that's when you see the real muscle come through. If you keep cutting, you're always in a caloric deficit, you're never really going to put on muscle. So, bulk up, you got to get effective before you cut and become efficient, and that's when you have a great result. Okay, what are some types of tests that you can run? So, there are some sort of basic incrementality tests. So you can test the incrementality of an entire channel where you say, we're going to restrict this entire channel, all of Meta, to just these 10 states. and we're going to go dark on Meta on these other states, right? That's a test and control setup at a channel level. You can do that at a campaign level. You can do that at a bidding strategy level. So you can say, I'm going to do a ROAS-based, T-ROAS-based bidding strategy in these particular 10 states, and I'm going to do a simple CPC-based strategy on these other 10 states. You can do an incrementality test on a targeting strategy. I'm going to go for just 7-day view through, or I'm going to do 1-day click or 7-day click, and different sort of targeting strategies there. That's not really a targeting strategy. That's more of a conversion optimization strategy, but you get my point. So you can do this pretty much at any ad level attribute, at set level attribute, campaign level attribute, and so on and so forth. There are a couple of other types of tests. So one is spend levels. So you can vary the spend level, and you can say that in these 10 states, we are going to have 50% higher budget or 50% lower budget than your business as usual. Or you can have completely new messaging or creative or copy in a particular test region. So there's a lot of different things that you can test. Pretty much any type of hypothesis is testable through incrementality testing. If you're a very large spender and you have lots of budget to deploy, you can also run multiple tests at the same time. And the way you arrive at the maximum number of tests that you can run is dependent on a few variables. So the natural variance in your data. So this means how many t-shirt sales are you getting? If you're only getting hundreds in a given month, or thousands in a given month, or tens of thousands in a given month, that scale and also how much natural variance or noise there is in that data dictates how much confidence we can have if we were to run, different geographic cells over that data, and therefore, how many different tests you can run. The number of cells, if your geographic distribution is very concentrated in just California and New York, that's probably not going to allow you to run multiple tests at the same time. You can probably only do one test at a given time. If it's spread very evenly across all of the US, then you have a lot of geographical cells to pick from. So that's another factor. The target lift. If you go for a higher lift, if you're going for a 20% lift, 30% lift, and that also dictates the budget, the higher the lift, the more tests you can do at the same time. If you're going for smaller lift numbers, then you need more sort of sample size. And so all of these things are related, right? The variance, the cells, the target lift, and then finally the length of the test itself. The longer the time period, generally, the higher the confidence in your test results. Now, we're not talking about a 12-month long test. So the typical length will vary from 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 8 weeks, things of that nature. And if you really want to do very high velocity, like 4-week tests, or 3-week tests, or 2-week tests, then one of the other things has to really sort of account for that, right? You have to go for higher lift, or you have to go for a higher sort of volume of geographies that you are testing in. So all of these things have to sort of work together to define the maximum number of tests that you can deploy. Now, geo-testing is not the only way to do an incrementality test. Pretty much every modern ad platform is going to have some type of a conversion lift capability. Conversion lift is just another jargon for an incrementality test. And the way in which it's different from a geo-based test is the following. In a geo-test, you are randomizing and setting up a test versus control set of geos. Conversion lift goes a little bit further. It's actually a cleaner way of doing an incrementality test because you're doing true user level randomization. And you can only do this if the ad platform allows you to. And so this is an example of a Meta conversion lift. And you'll see that if you open your Meta ads account, you can do that today. Go into your ads account, you will go to the experiments tab, and you will see 3 different types of tests: an A/B test, a brand lift test, and a conversion lift test. Now you'll notice, isn't an incrementality test the same thing as an A/B test? Not really. An A/B test is essentially testing 2 different versions of an ad. It's not testing the presence of the ad itself. And so conversion lift is essentially that. It takes your entire target audience and splits it into test and control buckets, truly randomized. and then exposes the test bucket to a specific campaign, set of campaigns or ad sets or what have you. So you can do this type of conversion lift on Meta, on Google, on YouTube, TikTok. Many other channels have these capabilities. There is an important caveat, which is for a conversion lift test to work, you have to feed server-side conversions into the ad platform, which means you have to have integrated with Conversion API, and whatever you consider your success metric to be, if that's, in the case of this example, t-shirt sales, then you're passing in data about your t-shirt sales on a per individual basis back into Meta. And you'll remember Conversion API from the very beginning of this course. So that's the same Conversion API and therefore the conversion lift experimentation. So if you haven't played around with this, I would highly recommend you check it out. LinkedIn has also made this possible in the recent past. And what this will allow you to do is at the end of your conversion lift test, you will see that there is a group, there's an audience that is not exposed to ads, and you see that in the blue here. And then you see the bucket in the purple that is exposed to ads, and the delta between them is the lift. And you see a lift score, which is essentially Meta's way of communicating certainty or confidence in the result. And you can see associated metrics around cost per conversion lift, and so on and so forth. So this is a much easier way of doing incrementality testing. It's available, but again, the caveat that you need a Conversion API integration. And there's one other caveat that I forgot, which is your match rate needs to be high. What is your match rate? When you pass in data through Conversion API, you are sending in data like the email address, a hashed version of the email address, or a hashed version of a phone number, or first name, last name, or IP address, or device ID, or whatever it might be. And there are limits to what you can share. And all of this is done in a secure way through hashing, basically a way of encrypting that data. And then Facebook has its own hashed version of their identity graph. And you are now matching your server-side data with Facebook server-side data to see which of your conversions and individuals match up with a unique person identity in Facebook. And if your match rate is 80% or higher, which means it can successfully match more than 80% of those identities, then the likelihood that you get a good result through conversion lift is higher. If your match rate is less than 50%, there's going to be some funniness in the confidence scores that conversion lift will have. So there is that caveat, and this is why sometimes geo-testing is better than doing an in-platform conversion lift test. There's also limitations on, conversion lift testing overall. So we can get into that in more detail in maybe a future course. So when you think about all the different marketing measurement methodologies, whether it's multi-touch attribution, whether it's Heidi Howe self-reported attribution, whether it's marketing mix modeling, incrementality testing, generally speaking, you want a combination of multiple approaches. That is essentially the best compromise that the industry has come to. If you want to focus on the most scientific methodologies, I would recommend things like MMM and incrementality testing. But I will also add that there's often the need for human judgment on top of these models. These models are also flawed, just like MTA and Heidi Howe. Like I said, there are no models that are perfect in precision and accuracy. And there's always data that is not included in these models just because that data is not digitized, it's not available in the shape that's needed by these models. So human advisory, human judgment, whether that's your internal teams, whether these are marketing science individuals, whether these are vendors who are doing these things for you, becomes critical and highly recommended if you are spending tens of millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars on your marketing. And the way to think about all of these marketing measurement methodologies ultimately is, what does it enable for your marketing team? And I think about 4 specific use cases. One is diversifying beyond your current marketing mix. Maybe you had a lot of success with Google and Meta in the early days, and you're realizing that those are getting expensive every year, and you're hitting diminishing returns, and you need to grow out to YouTube or TikTok or podcasts or CTV or whatever that might be. Also thinking about growth. So every channel is going to reach a point of saturation with the existing strategy, which means your existing creative or targeting or what have you. And experimentation and incrementality testing is a great way to break through those plateaus by trying out new ideas, new strategies, new targeting. And that sort of growth mindset is a key use case for these types of marketing measurement methodologies. The third is fixing your attribution models. So regardless of what you hear in this course, I'm pretty confident you're going to have some type of an internal attribution model based on some touch-based sort of capabilities. And as we talked about today, those models are naturally going to have some bias, and they're going to be a little bit weighted towards bottom of the funnel direct response type of channels. And so using some of these Heidi Howe MMM testing methodologies, you can fix that bias or apply the right multipliers, parameters on top of your internal attribution models. And then finally, forecasting. So partnering with your finance team, partnering with your analytics team to really understand what would happen if you were to invest an additional dollar into any given channel or into marketing as a whole, and better aligning on your progress towards your annual or quarterly or monthly goals. So if you have all of these use cases in mind, hopefully the course from today gave you some practical starting points into how you can solve for these use cases. All right, so that was a lot. Hopefully you got a ton of value out of this. Very soon we are going to be launching a quiz, maybe a way for you to test your knowledge on all things marketing measurement. So we'll ping you when that's ready. I hope you enjoy that quiz. It'll be a fun way for you to test your knowledge and also share this with other marketers who might benefit from both taking that course and testing themselves with a quiz to see if you can level up in your marketing career. All right. Thank you for watching this course.